On the morning of November 9th, 2022, Shaquille O'Neal drove a rental car through Newark, New Jersey at 5:47 in the morning, alone, in the dark, in the specific quiet of a city that has not yet decided to wake up. He was wearing a black hoodie, black sweatpants, black sneakers, the color of someone who is not trying to be seen. He turned off Springfield Avenue onto a side street and parked in front of a laundromat that was open, its windows fogged from the inside, its fluorescent lights the color of milk. Through the glass, he could see the machines running. He could see a woman sitting in a plastic chair against the far wall with her coat still on, and her head tipped back and her eyes closed, her hands folded in her lap around a phone. He sat in the car for a moment and looked at her. She was 45 years old. She was the oldest of his mother's children. She was his sister. He had not told her he was coming. He had not told anyone. He cut the headlights and sat in the dark with the engine running and looked at his sister sleeping in a plastic chair in a laundromat at 5:47 in the morning, and he did not move for a long time. 4 things registered before he opened the car door. First, the laundromat's front window had a paper sign taped to the inside of the glass. Open 24 hours, attendant on duty. Letitia was the attendant on duty. This was not one of her 3 jobs. It was a favor she was covering for a neighbor who had called in sick. Shaq did not know that yet. He saw the sign and filed it. Second, on the plastic chair beside her, a canvas tote bag with the logo of St. Michael's Medical Center, the hospital across town where she worked the 11 p.m. to 3 a.m. linen and laundry intake shift, with the drawstring pulled tight in the particular way of someone who packed in a hurry between one thing and the next. Third, tucked under the tote bag, barely visible, the corner of a yellow envelope. The kind that comes from a law office. The kind whose return address does not contain good news. He could see just enough of it to see that it had been opened and folded back and tucked away in the manner of something a person intends to deal with when they have time, and has not yet had time. Fourth, on the wall above the machines, a child's drawing, crayon on construction paper, taped at the corners, of a tall stick figure and a shorter one holding hands. Underneath, in the large looping handwriting of a child who has recently learned to spell, "Me and Mommy." He sat in the car until 5:51. Then, he got out. Now here is what nobody in that laundromat knew yet. Shaquille O'Neal had been in Newark for 11 hours, and his sister had no idea he was in the state. He had landed at Newark Liberty the previous afternoon on a flight he booked himself 4 days earlier, after a phone call from a woman named Yvonne Pearson that had lasted 22 minutes and that he had listened to without interrupting once. He had not called Letitia. He had checked into a hotel under a different name and spent the evening making 3 phone calls and reading a document that had been emailed to him from his foundation's Newark regional coordinator. A document that contained, among other things, a copy of a formal eviction notice filed on November 7th, 2022, by a property management company operating on behalf of a landlord named Gerald Pruitt, addressed to a tenant at 114 Halsted Street, apartment 4C, his sister's address. The eviction notice cited 3 lease violations accumulated over 14 months. He had read it twice. He had set his phone down on the hotel bed and looked at the ceiling for a while. He had thought about a particular conversation, the most recent one, 3 weeks ago. A FaceTime call. Letitia smiling in her kitchen, 2 of her kids visible in the background doing homework. He had said, "You good?" She had said, "We good." She had meant it to sound like the truth. He had let it. Stay with us, because what Shaq found when the sun came up over Newark that morning is a story about what love costs when it is too proud to ask for help, and what it looks like when someone who knows that price decides to pay it anyway. Letitia O'Neill was born in Newark, New Jersey in 1977. The first child of Lucille O'Neill and a man named Joe Toomey, who was present for the first 9 years of Letitia's life, and then was not. Shaq was born 5 years after Letitia, into a household that had already learned to operate around an absence. And it was Letitia, 9 years old when her brother arrived, 12 when their father left, who made the subtler adjustments that children make when an adult disappears and someone smaller has to fill the space. She did it without being asked. That was the thing about Letitia. She had never done anything because someone asked. She did things because they needed doing, and she was there, and she had decided, at some age too young to be making that kind of decision, that the gap between what was needed and what was available was hers to close. She had been closing it ever since. She had raised herself alongside her brother with the particular self-sufficiency of a child who learned too early that needing things was a form of vulnerability she could not afford. Their father's leaving had not broken her. It had done something more durable than breaking. It had calcified. At 17, sitting in the kitchen of the apartment on 18th Avenue, the night after the last time Joe Toomey's name was mentioned in the house, she had made a promise to herself in the wordless way that teenagers make their most consequential promises. The ones that run underneath the surface of every decision for the rest of their lives. She would never need anyone the way her mother had needed him. She would not ask. Whatever it took, she would manage. She had managed. She had managed for 28 years. She had 3 children, Marcus, 12, Destiny, 9, and a 5-year-old named Corey, who had recently taken to drawing his mother in crayon and taping the drawings wherever he could reach. She had a 2-bedroom apartment on Halsted Street that she had kept for 6 years. She had 3 jobs: cashier at a grocery on Broad Street, breakfast and lunch shift at a diner called Millie's 2 blocks off Clinton Avenue, and the overnight linen intake at St. Michael's Medical Center 3 nights a week. She had not told Shaq about the 3rd job. She had not told him about the 2nd rent increase. She had definitely not told him about the eviction notice, which had arrived on a Tuesday, and which she had opened standing in the hallway outside her apartment door, and then folded and tucked into her tote bag and carried to the laundromat, because there was no time that morning to sit down with it and figure out what came next. Gerald Pruitt was 53 years old, and he managed a portfolio of 14 residential properties in Newark's South Ward on behalf of 3 investment groups that had been quietly acquiring affordable rental units in the neighborhood since 2018. He was not a cruel man in the way that people imagine cruel men. He did not enjoy the work in any particular way. He was an efficient one. He understood the math of conversion. An affordable unit brought in $1,100 a month. The same unit renovated and repositioned to market rate brought in $2,400. The gap between those 2 numbers was his entire professional existence. He had developed, over 4 years of this work, a process. You did not simply raise the rent beyond what a long-term tenant could pay. That generated bad press and legal friction. You documented. You filed complaints. You accumulated violations on paper until the paper justified the action. The first complaint against Letitia's apartment had been a noise violation filed in September of 2021. Corey was 4. It was a Saturday afternoon. He had been playing in the living room at a volume indistinguishable from any child in any apartment on any block in Newark on a Saturday afternoon. The second complaint was a parking violation against a vehicle registered to Letitia's sister-in-law, who had visited twice. The third was a maintenance request that Pruitt's company had reframed on paperwork as evidence of tenant misuse of a fixture. Each one had been sent by a property manager who worked for Pruitt and who was good at the paperwork in the same way that Pruitt was good at the math. On the morning of November 7th, 2022, the eviction notice had been generated, reviewed, signed, and sent by a system that had no particular interest in who lived at 114 Halsted Street, apartment 4C. Letitia O'Neill was a number in a column that had not yet resolved to the right side of an equation. That was the whole of it. He had gone to bed that night and slept without difficulty. He had no idea what was coming. Millie's Diner opened at 5 a.m. Letitia arrived at 6:15, still in her coat from the laundromat, her tote bag over her shoulder, her eyes carrying the specific quality of exhaustion that is past the point of showing on a face and has become something structural. Something in the way a person holds their shoulders and sets their jaw and keeps moving with a determination that has long since stopped requiring rest as a condition. The diner was a narrow room, 10 counter stools, 7 booths, a pass-through window to a kitchen that smelled of bacon fat and coffee grounds, and the ghost of every breakfast that had been cooked there since 1987. The overnight manager was a woman named Yvonne Pearson, 68 years old. She had worked at Millie's for 19 years, which meant she had been the constant around which everyone else, cooks, servers, owners, regulars, had come and gone and returned and gone again. She was a small woman with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses she kept on a beaded chain, and the unhurried authority of someone who has been the most reliable person in every room she has ever occupied, and has made peace with what that costs. She had watched Letitia work doubles for 2 years. She had covered Letitia's breaks without being asked. 15 minutes here, 20 minutes there, so Letitia could sleep in the back booth with her coat over her, like a blanket. She had never said a word about it to Letitia, because she understood, the way women of a certain experience understand things, that the offer of help to a woman like Letitia was not a kindness but an insult, and that the only way to actually help her was to do it sideways, so she could not see it coming, and could not refuse. 3 months ago, Yvonne had gone home after her shift and found the website for the Shaquille O'Neal Foundation and filled out a community support application. She had described, in the plain specific language of a woman who has no patience for abstraction, what Letitia's situation was, what Letitia's children were, and what Letitia would never say about any of it. She had submitted the application and not mentioned it to a living soul. She had gone back to work the next morning and covered Letitia's break and said nothing. She was standing behind the counter pouring coffee when the bell above the diner door rang at 6:31 a.m. and Shaquille O'Neal walked in. The room had 6 people in it. A man in a transit authority jacket at the far end of the counter. 2 women in nursing scrubs in the second booth. A regular named Harold, who came in every morning and ordered the same thing and read the same section of the paper. Yvonne behind the counter. And Letitia, who had come out of the kitchen with a pot of coffee in each hand and who looked up at the sound of the bell and saw her brother standing in the doorway of the diner and stood completely still for a moment with both coffee pots in the air. She said his name. Just his name. The way you say the name of someone you were not expecting in a place where you did not want to be found. He said, "Hey, Tesh." He said it the way he had said it since she was 9 years old and he was 4 and had not yet grown into the body that would eventually make him difficult to fit through a standard door. He sat down at the counter. She set down the coffee pots. She did not hug him. She sat down on the stool beside him and looked at the counter and said, "How did you find out?" It was not a question. He reached into his hoodie pocket and placed the eviction notice on the counter between them, still in its yellow envelope, the one she had been carrying in her tote bag. She had not noticed it was gone. He had taken it from the bag while she was sleeping in the laundromat, read it in the parking lot, and put it in his pocket. She looked at it. She looked at him. She said, "I was going to handle it." He said, "I know you were." He said it without heat, without accusation, without the architecture of a grievance. He meant it entirely. He knew she would have. That was the whole problem. Yvonne was at the far end of the counter pretending to wipe it down and listening to every word. Here is the part that neither of them knew. The part that had been sitting in the room with them for 22 minutes before it surfaced. Shaq turned to Yvonne, who had been present for all of it and who had not pretended otherwise once the conversation began, and said, "You're Yvonne." She said, "I am." He said, "You filed the application." She said, "I did." Letitia looked at Yvonne, a long look, the kind that travels back through 2 years of covered breaks and 15-minute sleeps in the back booth, and never a word about any of it. Yvonne looked back at her without apology. She said, "You weren't going to ask. Somebody had to." Letitia said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You should have told me." Yvonne said, "You would have told me not to." Which was so accurate it ended the argument entirely. Two people who both loved the same woman, unknown to each other's actions, in the same room, in the same diner, in the same November morning light. Shaq looked at Yvonne for a long moment. He said, "She never asked." "That's the whole story." Yvonne said, "That's been the whole story since the day I met her." Harold at the end of the counter turned his newspaper page. The transit worker finished his coffee. Nobody else in the room said anything, but everyone in the room was listening, and none of them would ever quite forget what they heard. What happened next took 4 days and moved through several rooms, none of which were televised, and most of which Letitia has never discussed publicly. Shaq's team contacted the property management company operating under Gerald Pruitt's portfolio on the afternoon of November 9th. The eviction proceeding was withdrawn by November 11th. The legal instrument that produced that withdrawal involved a combination of a tenant rights attorney retained at Shaq's direction and a financial conversation that Pruitt's investment partners found clarifying in the way that people find things clarifying when they realize the math they were doing was incomplete. The specific terms were not made public. What was made public 6 weeks later, was that the O'Neill Family Foundation had partnered with a Newark housing advocacy nonprofit to establish a tenant stability fund, a direct support mechanism for single-parent households in the South Ward facing displacement by speculative rent increases. The fund's first beneficiary was not named. It did not need to be. On November 10th, the morning after the diner, Shaq had taken Marcus, Destiny, and Corey, his sister's 3 children, to breakfast at a place that served pancakes the size of hubcaps, which was Corey's specific and non-negotiable requirement for any restaurant. And he had sat across from them and listened to Marcus talk about basketball and Destiny talk about a science project, and Corey explain at length a drawing he had made that morning of a very tall man and a shorter woman holding hands. He had looked at the drawing for a moment. He had looked at the child who made it. He said, "That's good, man. That's really good." He paid for the pancakes. He drove them to school. He called Yvonne Pearson from the car and told her that Millie's Diner was going to receive a small business development grant from the foundation within the next 30 days, specifically designated for the overnight staff wage fund, and that there would be no application required. Yvonne was quiet for a moment and then said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "You filled out that form at midnight." "I think I did." He went to see Letitia one more time before he flew home. She was in her apartment. The kids were at school. She had coffee on. They sat at her kitchen table and she told him things she had not said out loud to anyone. Not all of it, not the full accounting, but enough. The third job. The 3 a.m. shifts. The way she had learned to pack the tote bag so nothing rattled when she carried it between jobs, because the sound of a rattling bag at 3 a.m. on a Newark street was a sound she had trained herself to eliminate. She said all of it to the window above the kitchen sink, not to him. The way people say the things they mean most, sideways, into the middle distance. So they can say it without having to watch it land. He listened without interrupting. When she was finished, he said, "You know Mama would have called me." She smiled. She said, "I know." He said, "So why didn't you?" She looked at the window for a moment. She said, "Because you already got out. I wasn't going to be the reason you had to come back." He sat with that for a long time. Then he said, "Tesh, getting out was never the plan. You know what the plan was." She looked at him. He said, "The plan was to get out and come back." He stood up. He hugged her, the specific and enormous hug of a 7-foot man who has known the same person since before either of them understood what the world was going to cost them. She let him. She even, for about 4 seconds, let herself cry. On the wall of Letitia's living room, above the television, there are now 5 crayon drawings by Corey. He has been prolific since November. In the most recent one, the tall stick figure has gotten taller. The shorter one stands beside him, and there are 3 smaller ones in a row. Underneath, in a 5-year-old's handwriting that is improving weekly, "My family." An old man who built a paper trail and slept without difficulty proved that systems do damage without requiring a villain. A woman behind a diner counter who covered breaks and filed applications in secret proved that love, when it understands the person it is for, learns to move without being seen. A sister who worked 3 a.m. shifts and sent birthday party photos and answered "we good" for 2 years proved what a vow made at 17 can cost a woman by the time she is 45, and what it looks like when someone who loves her decides the price has been high enough. And a brother who drove through Newark in the dark and sat in a parking lot and looked at his sister sleeping in a plastic chair and did not move for 4 minutes proved what Lucille O'Neill raised both of her children to know. You do not wait to be asked. You just come back. Drop a comment and tell us about someone in your life who never asks for help, but needs it. If this story reached you, the like button is right there, and it costs nothing. Subscribe and become part of a community that believes the people who say "we good" the fastest are sometimes the ones who need us the most. There is one more story waiting on the other side of this one, and it begins with someone who also said they were fine. We will see you there.